Imagine, Episode 5 by Bernard King and Nicholas Lumarine. Jerome is lost, asking why him could ruin everything. But Jemma has her own problems, and her son is one of them. When is Daddy coming? The question was innocent. The answer could not be. Jemma would have to reply with a lie. Dinners with her son Roland and Nicholas were becoming an acting masterclass. How could she tell her son her father was probably leaning against the hall wall in an alcoholic stupor, trying to connect his brain with his feet? Roland, now 9 years old, was, each time he came home from boarding school, a little more sensitive to atmosphere, a little cuter on the uptake, and more aware of the tension between herself and her husband. And it was taking creation and subterfuge to a higher level to be able to smile it away. Now was the start of the long summer holidays. It had already been established it was going to be difficult. Roland had arrived a day earlier than expected, and his father had welcomed him from behind a raised glass. So their son was still waiting for an answer as to why his father kept giggling and cuddling him and falling over the furniture. He was drunk, wasn't he? Two big blue eyes penetrated hers for an answer. Two big blue eyes, a shock of blonde curls that no haircut could control, and a feast of pale freckles on innocent skin, guaranteed lying to this little lad would be difficult now and impossible in a few months. His meeting had been very long. Perhaps he had drunk more than he intended. The lie slipped out easily, but the knot in her stomach tangled tighter. Was this how it was going to be? 24/7 deception, a diet of lies and a menu of deceit to stop her son from tasting the truth. The door opened. No, half opened. Someone was having difficulty finding the entrance. Both their glances were rewarded by a head flopping into the room. The eyes in the head were looking not at the diners or at the table, but at the sideboard, the keeper of bottles. "Fuck!" cursed the head. Controlling a frown with difficulty and without moving her head, Jemma swiveled a glance at her son. Roland was staring, a fixed stare behind which his young brain was grappling with truth and emotion. Unable to offer him an expression, Jemma closed her eyes. This was going to be a difficult lunch. "Oops, sorry." Jemma opened her eyes. Whiskey was dripping to the carpet. But Nicholas's second word was an improvement on his first. Roland had now computed his reaction and had retreated into great embarrassment, escaping tension by looking down at his plate. He had heard "fuck" whispered at school and had joined in the giggles under the sheets in the dormitory. Hearing it at home yelled by his father without his school friends and in front of his mother brought truths he could not deal with, so his stare remained fixed to the center of his plate. A bottle now joined the head around the door, a half-empty bottle that was rattled in his direction. "Got to get a refill." With an exaggerated wink, the head vanished back into the hall. They always sat for lunch at 1 o'clock. Nevertheless, Jemma looked at her watch. Actually seeing the time would establish beyond doubt that Nicholas's early alcoholic dose was now backing up into his late drinking. Soon his liquid lunch, diluvial dinner, and boozy breakfast would merge with his hourly aperitif, and his day would be spent behind one permanently raised glass. "Tomorrow I thought we could spend the day together at Whipsnade." The idea of going to the huge zoo in the countryside would be to get Roland out of the house and away from the stumblings of his father for a few hours. With Daddy? It was a natural question. It was a shame she could not give a natural answer. I think Daddy will be busy. But Daddy's always busy. Because you are on holiday, my darling, it doesn't mean Daddy is. Although she smiled, she was acutely aware she had just hammered another nail in the coffin of truth. The maid arrived with the lunch tray. Placing a plate in front of Roland, she looked at Nicholas's place and then questioningly at Jemma. As his place at the table was being filled less and less frequently, she now needed clues to whether he would be making an appearance. Satisfied by Gemma's nod, she placed a serving for Nicholas. Although Nicholas had made an appearance at the door, it did not follow he would actually enter the room and sit for lunch. Jemma gave him 3 minutes. We must start before it gets cold. Roland, always starving, hurled himself at the lunch, the food flying between his plate and his mouth, blurring the shape of his fork. Jemma watched with pleasure at the glee with which Roland emptied his plate. The question of having her son back from boarding school, a plea with which she was continually battered by her son, could not be answered. The battlefield of their marriage was no place for Roland. You started without me. Holding a full bottle of whiskey, Nicholas wove towards the table, slamming down both his bottom and the bottle of whiskey with uncontrolled thumps. With a knife, he poked at his meal, turning over the piece of steak with the point. If you knew what went on in that slaughterhouse, you would not eat this. The runner beans, given the double prod, brought no comment, but the mashed potatoes interested him greatly. How much butter is there in these? A forkful was lifted to eye level as if he expected it to answer. The gurgle was from the whiskey slopping into his glass. I have to watch my cholesterol. You have not eaten for 2 days. Jemma had to be careful. Roland had streaked through his meal and was watching. I drink my vitamins. Offering his raised glass in a toast to Jemma, he slurped 2 fingers of the spirit in a single gulp. In the slaughterhouses, they hang up cows on hooks through their bellies while they are still alive. Nicholas pushed his plate away and locked Jemma in a drunken stare. Jemma froze. The scenario she had been dreading had arrived. With Nicholas's drunken rambling, Roland could not be allowed near his father. She pressed the remote control to summon their maid. Roland had to be out of the room immediately. She took his hand, and pressing it tightly, she shook her head, trying to dismiss her husband's words as nonsense. Your father's just being silly. Of course they don't do that to cows. What? Nicholas lifted his glass, then lifted it higher before smashing it down on the table. What? This time the glass stayed immobile. The maid did not need an order. Quickly, she gathered up Roland, leading him protesting to the kitchen with the promise of an extra-large helping of dessert. Another 2 fingers of whiskey was hurled down his red lane before Nicholas attacked. Don't you ever say anything I say is silly, he screamed. Jemma stayed silent. This was a long-established routine. All she needed to watch out for were her husband's fists. The quivering finger, pointing, trying to find her face, established Nicholas was groping around his alcoholic cloud to find insults sufficiently hurtful to throw at her. You bitch, he snarled. Jemma smiled. He had not looked very far. Don't you come between me and my son. The wagging finger was losing its power and turning into a limp digit. Otherwise, the finger now collapsed, and the hand flapped beside its owner's head on the top of the table. Jemma did not wait for Nicholas's first snore. She pulled her feet away quickly from under the table, stood up and left, escaping the spreading pool of urine. The guest list had been on firstnight.com. He was able to wait in comfort with the cinema just around the corner from his office. Timing his arrival perfectly at the rear of the crowd of fans just before the glitterati arrived. Mr. and Mrs. Lumarine would definitely be glittering among that rati. It was the first film to be made of one of Nicholas's books. Jerome would see the drunken wife-beater in the flesh. Of course, he would also see Jemma. He did not try to kid himself. That was the reason he shivered in the cold and damp. The first nighters, mostly famous faces, lined past, some stopping to sign autographs and bathe in adoration. Others rushed through, tense and staring. Jerome assumed their expressions reflected the state of their careers. The Lumarines arrived to thin applause. Films are watched, not read. Jerome guessed that Nicholas was not in front of his usual audience, and had he not been walking the red carpet, he might have gone unnoticed, judging by the number of watchers who were questioning his identity. The slight stagger as he left the limousine, the sliding, loose smile, and the tight grip from Gemma's arm would have passed unnoticed had Jerome not known Nicholas's liquid secret. Whilst he had come to the cinema to satisfy his curiosity over Nicholas, he realized after the couple had disappeared into the foyer, his eyes had hardly left Jemma. The author had tossed his smile right and left to the fans as he was strolled forward. Jemma looked directly ahead, her face conveying nothing but an efficient public relations expression as she strove to keep her husband upright. Bedell Brooks was there, Jeffrey Unman had the fans screaming, and the star of the film, Henry Bermuda, snapped the ambulance teams into action, tending to fainting females. These men had queues outside their bedrooms. Girls hid in the boots of their cars and in their wardrobes to get near them. Jemma was clinking glasses with them now. She was attractive, she had class, and she had access to the world's sex symbols. Baffled, he turned away from the floodlights and the crowd, crossing Leicester Square on the brown-black carpet of pulp dead leaves. What was her fascination for this deadhead at the bottom of life's pyramid? He joined the queue for the bus, wondering how many times it would take for his brain to go pop by asking himself the same question. He felt as if he was getting lost in his own garden. The music, loud, booming music, arrived by his left elbow. The old classic, rocking all over the world, was moving the ribs in his chest. Either the inhabitants of the bus queue didn't like status quo, or men in black cars with a booming stereo that was trying to climb out of the windows. As one, they all turned and frowned. Charlie had arrived. He had forgotten his meeting with Charlie. He had been squashed aside by Jemma. In fact, everything had been squashed aside by Jemma, and Charlie had spotted him in the bus queue. "Where you been then?" Charlie had managed to make himself heard above Rick Parfitt's guitar, a feat that should have put him in the Guinness Book of Records. Jerome opened the car door, closed his eyes, and penetrated the wall of sound. Charlie turned Quo down. Jerome turned them down even further. "I've been waiting by the river for an hour." Charlie slipped the car into the first gear he could find and left the bus queue to waggle fingers in their ringing ears. By the river, Charlie placed the oblong box on the stone wall of the embankment. "You been in hospital? You ain't answered your phone or your emails." Jerome shook his head. "Been busy." He lifted the box and weighed it in his hand. "Where did you find it?" Jerome's question skipped out with delight. Charlie scratched his bristles. "Did I ask why you wanted it?" A glance inside the box was enough. Perfection. His gasp of delight was fired by the pleasure of the new addition to his collection. Jerome passed over the notes he had touched out of the cash machine for the meeting before Jemma had kidnapped his thoughts. "Nothing else?" Jerome was one of Charlie's more reliable customers, a regular who was still healthy, unlike many of his other clients. "3 more. I want just 3 more. I'll let you know which one first when I've made my choice." On the bus, the container weighed heavily across his knees. He kept the lid closed, impatience building each time he looked at the box. He would have loved to take a peek inside, but if the woman beside him got even a glance at his new friend, she would scream the bus to a standstill. Such was his hurry to get home, the call and the way from his neighbour opposite flew past him unnoticed. With his front door firmly bolted, he repeated his key routine, taking the first from the ledge under the stairs, the second from behind the piece of false skirting, before slipping the electronic keypad from his wallet. A push from his fingertips, and the door swung open. He paused in the entrance as the warm air rushed out, sticky with the smell of oil and metal. The bright halogen spotlights blazed, and he moved forward into his world of pleasure. He placed the box on the green field table, lifted the lid, and with his hands, trembling with delight, lifted out his prize. Yes, it was perfect. He knew it would be. Charlie only dealt in the best. Content and satisfied, he carried number 27 at arm's length to its new home to the right of centre on the left-hand wall. The bottle of whisky, ready to be poured into the tumbler, waited on a table. No, it was not a table, but a brown steel box, upended to serve as such. The whisky did not wait long. Jerome's 14 stones bulged the officer's canvas seat as it folded to his bottom, the back stretching the material tight, expanding Field Marshal Montgomery, the name printed across the back. Automatically, he poured himself a glass, took a short sip, and with his eyes never leaving the wall in front of him, he stretched out with a long, slow sigh and relaxed in the wonder of contentment. Starting from the left, he slowly picked up every detail of his collection, sometimes lingering on a memory loaded with pleasure, sometimes sweeping past a peace-provoking pain. Time was not important from the moment he had closed the door. He had left the world, his passion carrying him through the folds of his imagination as he stared and stared. The phone rang 7 times before he resurfaced. "Jerome, mate, I'm sorry." Charlie sounded genuinely sorry, his tone draining downwards. "I forgot the little bits." Little bits? Jerome was still 6 feet above life. "Oh, yes." But he was getting back. "I'll bring them on the next meet." No. Jerome's world was not complete. He had to have them now. He would go to Charlie's place. He would be there in an hour. His dreams were shattered. He must leave his heaven. Clutching the empty whiskey glass, he allowed himself the pleasure of a parting look. He had worked hard on the room. Painted puffs of fair-weather cumulus, but not too many, hung in the blue ceiling, as good an effect of the sky as he could get. The walls, all of them, including the door around him, their hard edges smudged with the heavy brown and green of war camouflage. The floor was a muddy, yellow desert, strewn in places with small stones and rocks, all carefully glued into place. But it was the reflected blue glint on black metal, the machined holes of death, the smell of light oil, the scarred but still polished wood, and the absolute power that ranged his walls that was his turn on. His latest edition brought his collection to 27. 27 of the finest handguns in the world. 27 weapons of the British Army. Some had been used in anger, some were prime and factory fresh. Some he had killed with, and one had been taken from him. It was number 22, a Browning 9mm. Relieved of his command, the CO's open palm had demanded it. He took down the replacement. The army still had his original pistol, and stroked the barrel across his palm, his memory wriggling back 6 years. Soldiers died with their guns. They never surrendered them, and he would have died with his, like his men had. The bullet had cut a groove in his steel helmet. The deafening shriek and the sickening thud smashed life off. Unconsciousness dragged him in, and then black. He jutted back in the helicopter, was flown back to the UK, and 2 months later was charged. The model of the battlefield at his courts-martial showed the obvious. The fold in the desert, 100 meters ahead of his advancing platoon, was packed with the enemy. He should have known it was there. He should have known they were there. His men were tired. There was no advance scout to warn, so they were butchered, all of them. 2 sloppy seconds had destroyed 20 years of perfection. They took his gun and his badges and pushed him out of the gate. His knuckles boned white with his grip on the handle. He raised the gun, pointed it towards the window, and eased back the trigger. The click of the hammer striking an empty chamber, lifeless and dull, cut through his dream. Like most exhibitions and museums, his collection was dead. Guns were made to be used, to roar, slap of recoil in one's hand, smell of cordite and hot oil, not hang lifelessly on a wall. So he brought life to his armory, a reminder he once had in his trigger finger. He started his second collection. 2 large steel filing cabinets, also wearing camouflage, stood either side of the door, their oiled drawers opening with just a finger touch. In a neatly tagged compartment lay the pistol's nourishment. Ammunition, 50 rounds for each of his weapons. The cupro-nickel heads of the bullets glowed dully in the lights, in disciplined diagonals, tight in their boxes, except for one box. There were gaps in the Lee Enfield stock. Jerome's shooting range was underneath the chapel in Pond Street in Hampstead. The owner turned a blind eye to the range of guns Jerome arrived with, provided he was allowed the pleasure to use them as well. Jerome's last practice shoot had not been good. For once, his 9 out of 10 average for bullseyes had dropped to 6. His concentration had not been applied with its usual precision. Jemma had started her invasion of his thoughts. 30 rounds were missing. He had fired 20 and the owner of the range 10. Charlie would have the replacements along with the ammunition for his latest chum, number 27. His final glance around the room, as usual, rested on a china bust of his hero, Sir Winston Churchill. From an early age, he had worshipped the man and all he stood for. Sliding the cabinet shut, he carefully secured all the locks and hid the keys. To have such an armory in a suburban house would mean several years in prison if he was discovered. To have matching ammunition would mean several years more. The scream from his mother when, as a 7-year-old, he spilled her cooking oil on the kitchen floor while he was cleaning his plastic pistol. The strange look from his friends when they saw his massive collection of replica firearms on his bedroom wall and almost weekly trips to war museums were an early sign of his addiction. Drugs, sex, and rock and roll, the usual Addo magnets, were subservient to his passion for the windy shooting ranges of Bisley, and so there was little surprise when on his 18th birthday he signed his life away to the British Army. His guns were his life, his love, his everything. They were his only lie in his marriage. His wife would not have them in the house, but they were there, the start of his collection, only 2 found, forgotten in a box in a loft. She would not go into the loft. Curtains of cobwebs, having to climb a ladder and balance on rafters, were barriers she would not cross. 2 months after the earthquake of her walkout, his metal mistresses moved downstairs. With the arrival of the internet, collections that once were rare, but with global exposure and easy availability, prices were crashing. His collection ballooned rapidly, and the back bedroom became his heaven. He joined the grey circle of collectors, sometimes spending days swapping a dozen weapons to get the gun he wanted. His speciality were handguns of the British Army from 1900 to date, and he had them all except 3. As with all collections, the last few were scarce and expensive. Then he met Charlie. Charlie was the modern-day Spiv, a fixer. He could get anything for anybody, for a price, and if it was illegal, it was all the more juicy. Charlie found Jerome's 3 missing weapons within days, but at prices much wider than Jerome's pockets. It would take months of dealing, trading, part exchanging, and ducking and diving to get remotely near just one of them. And Charlie was a salesman. He used the ammunition Jerome had ordered as bait. In his car, he passed Jerome not only the bullets, but also a small, waxed paper package. 70 quid and it's yours. The round, ridged shape nestled in his hand as the designer had intended. He unwrapped it, not to discover its identity, but to identify its power, condition, and fuse time. He had used hand grenades many, many times. Without thinking, he pulled out the firing pin. No! Charlie's yelp of terror, his door almost ripping off the hinges as he hurled himself out, and his scrabbling run to the nearest corner took 4 seconds. The fuse in the grenade was 6 seconds, Jerome observed, turning the weapon upside down. Charlie, spread-eagled against the wall, sweated, waiting for a torrent of debris to hurtle past the corner. With no explosive roar, or his car vaporizing and Jerome disintegrating in the wind after 10 seconds, that were more like 20, a neck stretched cautiously out to allow a pair of eyes, a puzzled peep, back around the brickwork. A whole and healthy Jerome, also puzzled, gazed back through the windscreen. "You pulled the bloody pin!" Charlie was still shaking. He trembled and stumbled back into the car. Jerome had pulled the safety pin, but the grenade was in one hand and the pin in the other. He held up the deadly egg for inspection. His palm, pressed casually against the firing lever, kept in one piece. Gently he slipped the firing pin back through the casing, making the immediate district safe and secure. "You're mad, you're bloody insane!" Charlie threaded himself cautiously back behind the steering wheel. Grenades were not handguns. It would not fit into his collection. But he knew a man into whose collection it would. Gilbert's. Gilbert collected anything that went bang without having to pull a trigger, with a particular affection for landmines. Jerome's description over the phone was accurate except for the price. 120. 120. Gilbert whistled in mock surprise. 100, he retaliated. 115. I'll think about it. Jerome pocketed his telephone. It was as good as sold. Gilbert had a buying pattern that never varied. He would collect the grenade within a month. What about the Glock 17? It'll only take a week. Charlie's sales technique never varied also. He was adept at squeezing out the last drop of profit. The Glock 17 was the latest British handgun, still spitting death in Afghanistan, one of Jerome's last 3 desires. But the £2 sign was followed by too many zeros for Jerome's money box, and the last gun, his 27th, had cleaned him out. "I'll call you." Charlie nodded and grinned. He knew collectors. Jerome would have the gun within months. With a grenade in the Marks and Spencer's carrier bag with the ammunition, Jerome left Charlie and crossed Leicester Square towards the bus stop. The cinema was still showing Nicholas's Epic. The last screening of the day was starting in 10 minutes. On an impulse, Jerome joined the short queue. He was not interested in Nicholas or his stories, but for the next 2 hours he felt he would be near something connected to Jemma. The man who was following Jerome moved into the queue behind him. It had been cold and wet watching Jerome talk to the guy in the car. At least he would be warm and dry in the cinema. Imagine, who is the man following Jerome? Imagine, why is the man following Jerome? Imagine, the next episode in 2 weeks.